Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Wednesday night Bible study as we continue our series in Mark. Last week, we talked about Jesus calling disciples and what being a disciple of Jesus means. This week, we see Jesus engage in a series of controversies with the religious leaders of his day. And this reminds us that following Jesus is something that can result in controversy. The controversies, all in one way or another, the controversies that we're going to look at tonight, they all in one way or another connect to Jesus' identity and mission. You might remember from our first class that Jesus' identity and mission, these are key driving forces in Mark that propel his gospel account along. We're going to see that Jesus' identity and mission were not popular among some people, particularly the religious leaders of Jesus' time. Mark lets us know early on in his gospel account that these leaders seriously oppose Jesus' ministry and they want to see it come to an end. So these controversies are found in chapter 2, verse 1 through chapter 3, verse 6, and they read in succession, one right after another. It's doubtful that these events actually happened one right after another, or that they even happened in this order. The gospel accounts are not interested in presenting Jesus' life in chronological order. And just comparing Matthew, Mark, and Luke will show that the order of events is often different for each one. And usually thematic and literary reasons are actually behind the order in which they put their content instead of chronological reasons. Jesus' controversies with the religious leaders, that is the thematic thread that connects these events that we're going to look at tonight, that explains why Mark keeps them all together. So as we look at these controversies tonight, let's keep Jesus' identity and mission in mind. Mark has already told us right at the beginning that Jesus is the Messiah and he is the Son of God, and he is proclaiming God's kingdom. So let's see how these things influence our controversies tonight. So again, our controversies are found in chapter 2, verse 1 through chapter 3, verse 6. But I want to set some context from the material surrounding these controversies to help us appreciate their significance. So first, I want us to note that these controversies come after Mark tells us that Jesus is becoming well known. His fame is spreading, and great crowds are following him. Second thing to mention, a big part of why crowds are drawn to Jesus is because he is healing illnesses and casting out demons. And Mark takes a moment to tell us about this shortly before and also right after the controversies that we're going to look at tonight. I want us to focus on the significance of these healings, especially those involving casting out demons. I want us to think about that in future classes, but for tonight, I just want us to note that Jesus is engaging in spiritual conflict when he casts out these demons. He's not simply acting like a doctor who has special medicine or something like that. He is engaging the spiritual forces of darkness. And this should remind us that Jesus' controversies with the religious leaders, these are not just theoretical or academic discussions. These controversies are part of how Jesus combats spiritual evil in the world around him. Sometimes that evil is in the form of demons. Other times, like what we're going to see tonight, it's in the form of religious leaders who seek to oppose Jesus' mission. So for tonight, I'd like us to focus on what Jesus does that creates controversy, what exactly his opponents object to about Jesus, and how Jesus responds to his opponents. There are 5 controversies within our portion of Mark for tonight. In our first passage, Jesus heals a paralyzed man who was brought by 4 of his friends to Jesus' house. And the crowd is so dense, there's so many people together that the friends cannot reach Jesus, so they end up making an opening in the roof of the house to let the paralytic down to him. Jesus does not immediately heal the man. He first tells him that his sins are forgiven, and this is the controversial part of the passage. The scribes who are present are wondering how Jesus can speak about forgiving sins, because only God can forgive sins. So this is a blasphemous statement that Jesus is making. So their objection here is connected to Jesus' identity and mission. Who does Jesus think he is? They're saying or thinking to themselves. What does he think he's doing? And Jesus then heals this paralyzed man as well, and the man is able to walk home. In our second passage, Jesus calls Levi, or Matthew, the tax collector, to follow him, just like he called Peter, Andrew, James, and John that we looked at last week. And Jesus is then eating in Levi's house along with other tax collectors and sinners as well. And the scribes of the Pharisees see this, and they ask Jesus' disciples why he eats with tax collectors and sinners. So their objection is connected to Jesus' identity and mission again. Who does Jesus think he is? What does he think he's doing eating with tax collectors and sinners? And then in our third passage, some people, and notice it's not the scribes or the Pharisees this time, but some people come to Jesus and they ask him why his disciples aren't fasting like John's disciples or the Pharisees' disciples. So their objection, or at least their question here is, again, who does Jesus think he is? What does he think he's doing by not fasting? And then in our fourth passage, the Pharisees see Jesus plucking heads of grain for food as they pass through a field on the Sabbath. The Pharisees ask Jesus why his disciples are doing what is unlawful to do on the Sabbath. So again, their objection is, who does Jesus think he is? What does he think he's doing by letting his disciples pluck grain on the Sabbath? And then in our fifth and our final passage, Jesus enters a synagogue, and there is a man there with a withered hand. And Mark tells us that the Pharisees are watching Jesus closely to see if he is going to heal on the Sabbath. And he tells us that they are basically hoping that he will heal on the Sabbath so that they can accuse him of breaking the Sabbath. And Jesus, of course, heals the man. And so for the fifth time, the objection basically is, who does Jesus think he is? What does he think he's doing by healing on the Sabbath? So these questions have all related to Jesus' identity and mission. And the way Jesus answers these questions, they end up revealing something about his identity that the scribes and the Pharisees do not like hearing. So, now that we've seen why certain people are confused and offended by Jesus and objecting to him, let's take a look at Jesus' responses. When Jesus heals the paralytic and the scribes thinks he is blaspheming by claiming to forgive sins, Jesus responds by saying that he does have the authority to forgive sins, and he demonstrates this authority by healing the paralyzed man. So the scribes are objecting, who does Jesus think he is? And Jesus responds by saying, I am someone who has the authority to forgive sins. This is quite a statement. Jesus is not a priest, and this man has not offered any sacrifices according to the law. So Jesus, according to most people, would not be in a position to speak for God. But Jesus says that this man's sins are forgiven anyway. When the scribes and the Pharisees asked Jesus' disciples why Jesus is eating with tax collectors and sinners in Levi's house, Jesus is made aware of this question, and notice his response in chapter 2 and verse 17. When Jesus heard it, he said to them, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. Jesus defends his actions by saying that he didn't come to call the righteous. He came to call sinners. They are the ones who need him, just like the sick are the ones who need a physician. So the scribes and the Pharisees are objecting, what does Jesus think he's doing? And Jesus responds by saying he's doing exactly what he came to do. He is calling sinners to repentance. When people ask Jesus why his disciples aren't fasting, Jesus responds with some comparisons. Wedding guests do not fast when the bridegroom is with them. Weddings are occasions of joy and celebration. Unshrunk cloth shouldn't be put on an old garment, otherwise the cloth will at some point tear and make an even worse tear than the original tear that made the patch necessary in the first place. Wine has to be put into the right skin, or else the wine is ruined. New wine must be put into new wineskins, otherwise the wine will burst the wineskins. Basically, Jesus is saying that his identity and mission call for a change of behavior. God is doing something new and important through Jesus, and it is something that should motivate the people of God to celebrate. So the people were objecting, or at least they were asking, what does he think he's doing by not fasting? And Jesus responds that who he is and what he is doing calls for a different kind of response than normal. When the Pharisees asked Jesus why Jesus' disciples are plucking heads of grain on the Sabbath, Jesus makes a bold statement. He first clarifies the Sabbath, saying that it was made for man, not the other way around, not man for the Sabbath. And he then declares that he is Lord even of the Sabbath. So the Pharisees here were objecting. What does he think he's doing by allowing his disciples to do what is unlawful on the Sabbath? And Jesus responds by saying that the Pharisees misunderstand the Sabbath, and that Jesus is the one with the authority to say how the Sabbath should be followed. And then when the Pharisees are hoping that Jesus will break the Sabbath so that they can accuse him of doing this, Jesus again offers a different understanding of the Sabbath. Doing good and saving life are lawful. So when the Pharisees again object, who does he think he is? What does he think he's doing by breaking the Sabbath? Jesus responds that his actions are in line with what is good and right to do on the Sabbath. So when we put Jesus' responses together, he says that he has authority to forgive sins, that he came to call sinners to repentance, that God is doing something new through Jesus that calls for new responses, that he has authoritative interpretations of the Sabbath, and that his actions of bringing life are in line with what is good and right to do on the Sabbath day. Something else I want us to notice is that Mark builds tension in these controversies. The reactions of the religious leaders who oppose Jesus, they become increasingly more vocal and more expressive, and their feelings become more intense throughout this section. Notice that when Jesus heals the paralytic, no one actually says out loud that Jesus is blaspheming. The scribes are saying this in their hearts. And because Jesus knows what they are thinking, he calls them out on their thoughts. When Jesus is eating with Levi and the other tax collectors and sinners in Levi's house, the scribes of the Pharisees approach his disciples, not Jesus himself, but his disciples, and ask why Jesus eats with these people. And when Jesus hears about this question, he gives his answer about calling sinners rather than the righteous. So we've gone from having silent and inner objections about Jesus to speaking now to Jesus' disciples. And then when Jesus is asked about fasting, this time the people are written as asking Jesus directly this question. And then when Jesus' disciples are plucking heads of grain on the Sabbath, the Pharisees this time ask Jesus directly why they are doing what they consider to be unlawful Sabbath work. And then when Jesus heals the man with the withered hand, Mark tells us that the hearts of the Pharisees are hard. And afterwards, they get together with the Herodians and they plot about how to destroy Jesus. They want him gone and they want him done away with by the end of this series of controversies. So we've gone from having inner thoughts about Jesus blaspheming to seeking to kill him over the course of this part of Mark's narrative. And verse 6, where we read about seeking to kill Jesus, this is probably not only about the healing of the man with the withered hand. Planning to destroy Jesus comes about as the culmination of everything that has been happening since chapter 2 and verse 1. Something that's important to mention here is that the Pharisees didn't really have a lot of political power by the first century. They were popular among the common people, but that didn't fully translate into political influence. And we'll see later in our study that it's the Sadducees rather than the Pharisees who have the strongest hand in putting Jesus to death at the end of Mark. And so this makes their plotting with the Herodians in verse 6 significant. We don't read all that much about the Herodians in the New Testament, but just their name makes it clear that they are connected to Herod, the ruler of the region. So the Herodians are people with political influence. So the Pharisees aren't just looking to smear Jesus' name or ruin his reputation. They don't have a lot of political influence, so they are seeking the people who do have the influence to ensure Jesus is removed from the picture. They want to kill him. We mentioned a couple of weeks ago that Mark includes the detail in his prologue that the beginning of Jesus' ministry is connected with John the Baptist's arrest. And since John prepared the way for Jesus, his arrest gives us a clue that Jesus' ministry will not be received well by everyone. And here we're seeing that this is the case. The Pharisees want Jesus out of the picture, and they meet with people who may be able to help make that happen. Something else that is important to note is that Jesus won't be arrested and crucified until chapters 14 and 15. But right here, in only the 3rd chapter of Mark, we're told that the religious leaders want to get rid of Jesus. So Mark is giving us some foreshadowing early on in his gospel of Jesus' eventual death. This series of controversies in this part of Mark show us that the religious leaders were offended by Jesus and by what Jesus was claiming for himself through his actions. And in each of their objections, again, they're basically asking, who does this guy think he is? And what does he think he's doing? They may have thought that Jesus was quite an arrogant person, even though he was nothing of the sort. And Jesus doesn't back down when he's asked these kinds of questions. He goes on to clarify something about who he is and what his mission is. He has the authority to forgive sins. He is here for the sinners, to bring them to repentance. His understanding of the Sabbath is the true and the correct one, and he brings life and goodness on the Sabbath. What Jesus says in the middle of these 5 controversies probably sums all this up the best. This is when he is asked why his disciples don't fast. God is doing something new through him that calls for a different and joyous response from God's people. Through Jesus, something new is coming. Now, what we already know, and what perhaps some people in Mark are beginning to pick up on, is that these things are part of the identity and mission of the Messiah, the Son of God. Mark has told us that this is who Jesus is at the very beginning of his gospel. The religious leaders are coming face to face with the mission of God's Messiah, though they probably don't realize that's who they're coming face to face with yet. But they're coming face to face with the mission of God's Messiah, and they aren't liking it right now. I mentioned at the beginning of class that this opposition of theirs is more than just academic. It's spiritual. On either side of these controversies, we see Jesus fighting the powers of darkness through his healings and casting out demons. He's fighting another form of spiritual darkness against the scribes and the Pharisees in these controversies. And these controversies, they end with the Pharisees seeking to destroy him. And so it looks like the spiritual forces of darkness are going to work with these Pharisees triumphing over Jesus by destroying him. But as we know, Jesus' death only looks like the triumph of darkness and evil. It's actually a major victory for the forces of good and for God and for his people. And we get a foreshadowing of that death at the end of these controversies. So next week, I'd like you to read chapter 4, verses 1 through 34. We're going to look at an extensive portion of teaching that Mark records from Jesus. So I'm looking forward to that. But thank you for joining us. I hope all of you are doing well. Take care in this difficult weather, and have a great rest of the week. Thank you.